Joining us is Michael Kugelman, the South Asia expert at the Woodrow Wilson Center. He's with us from Washington, D.C. Good evening, Michael. My first question to you is, what do you think prompted Donald Trump to declare this major withdrawal?
Well, President Trump has never been comfortable about an extended U.S. military presence in Afghanistan. And I think that this is simply him acting on his increasing impatience. I mean, we saw what he had done just a few days earlier with his decision to withdraw troops from Syria. So I think that, when he took office, even when he came out with his Afghanistan strategy, he was never comfortable staying in Afghanistan. And of course, we know that several senior aides convinced him to rethink his decision to withdraw and essentially convinced him to stay. Some may suggest, those that are more optimistic would suggest that Trump was making this announcement as a concession to the Taliban to essentially capitalize on what had been some fairly productive informal talks between very senior Taliban officials and U.S. representatives in the UAE the other day. The idea there would be that by declaring this intention to withdraw half its troops, that would give the Taliban a huge concession and make it willing to want to talk about ending the war. But I don't think that's the case. From everything that I've heard so far, and from discussions I've had with those that would know, it does seem that Trump really simply wanted to get out, and he made his decision for reasons having nothing to do with these recent talks with the Taliban in the UAE.
I have to agree. Concession to the Taliban sounds like a very, very generous assessment of what has happened. Does it, though, amount to conceding defeat to the Taliban and to the general situation in Afghanistan? Also, has Taliban then scored a propaganda win, if nothing else?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I've been saying over the last few hours in my media engagements that this is a huge propaganda coup for the Taliban, because it essentially got what it's always wanted, that being a withdrawal of U.S. troops without having to give up anything in return and without having to sign a deal or anything. It's really quite extraordinary. But that said, let me put out a bit of good news, a bit of a reality check. I mean, yes, if Trump really does pull out half of the troop presence in Afghanistan, that's a really bad thing. However, it's not a catastrophic decision. There will still be at least 7,000 U.S. troops remaining. There will be 8,000 NATO troops. And presumably, the U.S. financial support for the Afghan security forces will continue to flow, and that is really a lifeline for the Afghan security forces. If the Afghan army and the security forces are going to collapse, it wouldn't be because the U.S. forces are leaving. It's because they would run out of money. And so far as I know, that has not been affected, though, of course, it could come later. I mean, now that Trump is willing to start withdrawing, I mean, that could mean that the aid spigots, the financial aid to the Afghan security forces could be reduced soon as well. But for now, I think that's not the case.
Right. It's not a full withdrawal, but it could be the precursor to something like that. What does it mean for this region, especially for India and its efforts towards rebuilding Afghanistan?
Well, I think that with India, it seems to me that India has really been written out of this entire script, so to speak. I mean, what we've had in the last few weeks is the U.S. getting much more deeply involved in a reconciliation process. Pakistan has also been very involved, and the U.S. Trump specifically called on the Pakistanis to assist the U.S. in bringing the Taliban to the table. And now we have this news that the U.S. is going to pull out many of its troops, which I think could well, in the absence of a deal or ceasefire, lead to increased levels of violence and instability in Afghanistan, which clearly is a net loss and a net disadvantage for India. So, it really is a bit of a troubling state of affairs if you look at this from the perspective of New Delhi. But I think from the perspective of Washington, it's a bad thing, too. I mean, the U.S. has really lost a lot of credibility. It's staged this unilateral withdrawal. It hasn't gotten anything in return. It's really, I think, damaged its relationship with the Afghan government, which I think was not apprised, was not aware that this decision was going to come. So it really is a bit of a mess right now.
And where does this leave Russia, which is also simultaneously engaging with the Taliban? Does it lose any leverage if they had any to start with?
Well, I think that Russia had been upstaged in these recent UAE meetings. I think Russia has been trying to telegraph its desire to play a greater role in Afghanistan, and particularly to get a reconciliation process going. It hosted this peace conference in Moscow a few weeks ago that, brought a lot of key players to the table. But then you had this UAE conference in which you had very senior Taliban officials talking with the Americans, but also the Pakistanis and the Saudis. These are big players. But now I think that Russia wins out again. I mean, the more the U.S. presence recedes in Afghanistan, the more Russia benefits, and also the likes of China and Iran and all of these other regional players, and Pakistan for that matter as well. They'll have more of an ability to deepen their footprint and increase their influence, whether that's positive or negative.
Michael Kugelman, thanks very much. Pretty chaotic state of affairs there. Half of the 14,000 U.S. troops will be pulled out of Afghanistan after Donald Trump has announced his major withdrawal. We understand that New Delhi is talking to Washington, not very pleased with the turn that things have taken, but we'll have to wait and see how this goes.